they won't shoot me down soon. They sing on a sleepless night. Try to catch me howling at the moon.
There's a 3-mile limit that you can't get inside of that 3-mile limit down Chatham because all the lobster fishermen got their gear out. But that's where all the flounders were. So at nighttime in fog, we would go in.
They would go out there in the morning and the boat would be just on the other side of the 3-mile line. The boats would go outside the 3-mile line for the rest of the day, be legal. And as soon as the lobster guys went home and it got dark, they came back inside.
We were fishing inside the limit, eating 50, 60 baskets at one time. And I'm on the stern and I'm looking. And I said, Jesus Christ, that looks like the police boat. So I said, that is the police boat. I ran down the engine room, climbed under all the nets, spare nets that we had, and I threw them over top of me, right? And I heard the boat go out of gear. I said, oh, they're on the shallow G now, because they just got off the Shirley and rolling. And I stayed there and I didn't move. They came down with flashlights and everything, and they were looking all around, but they didn't see me. But I could see through the net. And then all of a sudden I heard the boat go in gear again. I said, oh, they all left. So I go back on deck, and my father looks at me and he says, how do you think? You're not going to pay a fine? I said, yeah, I'll pay the fine, but I don't have to go to court.
Every fisherman's pirate, actually. I can remember being down the shore during that period and seeing Jackie Owl was the local lobster fisherman here. And I could see him loading cement blocks and barbed wire onto his boat. And he'd set that around his gear. So that when the dragger comes along, they'd only pick up, and they'd get his gear, of course, there's parts possibly, but they'd tow up the barbed wire and cement blocks and raise hell with their net.
It was the early 70s, and these guys were coming in at night, just towing through the lobster pots to get to the flounders. So one time, I asked my mother last night, she did remember this. So he goes out, and he's missing a pile of gear. And back then, it was all Eastern rig draggers, where they would bring the net in on the side of the boat, and so they'd take a wrap, and they'd bring it up, and the guys would reach out for the twine. So we go up to Sears and Roebuck in Hyannis, and my father proceeds to load the back of the pickup truck with barbed wire. So the guys, they would haul back at night with no lights, and the lighting was terrible anyway. They'd reach out to grab the twine, and there was barbed wire in the twine. Some of the guys got tore up because of the barbed wire. Then the boat would make a roll, and the barbed wire would catch their oil gear or their gloves and stuff. And they had an awful time getting the barbed wire out of the net. I remember going with him, and he's setting it out, and he put it on he had a pipe. He made a pipe rack, and he tied all the barbed wire together. And he just threw the concrete blocks and just steamed it out. And it went roll after roll after roll. It was, and they all did it, you know, just to get rid of these guys. And it worked. He wasn't the only one. Ralph Long did the same thing, and I know Rip Griffin did. They all go up and they get barbed wire. They tie a rope to the end of the barbed wire with cinder blocks, and they just ran it out. Spool after spool after spool. I thought we were going to raise cattle or chickens. By the time we left Sears and Roebuck, I looked at my mother and went, what's going on? I said, could have animals or something? She goes, no, your father figured out a way to get at the draggers. They were destroying his livelihood and taking the food off his table. Yeah, I know there was 4 of them that suffered real bad. I mean, it was, you know, you see these lobster wars, but these were, back then, everybody did their own thing. They weren't waiting for the government to help them. They just decided how they were going to do it. I just think the tipping point was the amount of gear they started to lose. You know, their season was coming to an end because they didn't have any traps to pull. You know, they would go out there. I don't know what they had. I don't think they had the amount of traps back then. I think they had 300 or 400 traps. And when you go out there and you're losing, I think my father said he'd like back, and best I can remember, because this was a very long time ago, he figured he had lost 100 within a couple of weeks. Well, it was hard back then. The electronics weren't good, finding your way in and out of the harbors, and they particularly did it on the foggy nights when nobody's going to see. They would tow at night with no lights on. They didn't have their lights on their boats at all. They came in, threw the net over, and they would tow, and then they would tow to outside the 3-mile line to haul the net back where they could turn on all their lights, dump their bag of fish, steam back over the line, throw the net over, tow inside with no lights on.
The dragger that caused a lot of trouble for them was out of New Bedford. It was the Lark was the name of the dragger. A guy named McCarthy was skipper of it, and they had an ongoing battle. There was a whole lobster war that went on at that time.
It was really bad. And my father went out there that day, and he pulled up to the guy, and he said, "Jerry, I'm taking you in. I've had enough of your SHIT. And F you and all," and he just went back. And my father calls the Coast Guard, and the guy starts steaming away, and my father gets in front of him to stop him. Well, he started to ram him. I remember today there was black paint down the whole, from the middle of the boat all the way to the stern when I went with him a few days later. My father was really shook up after this happened. So he puts the boat in gear and gets away from him, and he proceeds to shoot the living hell out of this thing. He had a sail up in the rigging. My father went ballistic on this thing, for all the right reasons, because they lost hundreds. They were all losing traps like crazy, and these guys were towing around at night. But my father went out there one day, and his traps were, buoys were floating everywhere. And he knew who the guy was, because my father, it was the Kavanaugh fleet in Woods Hole years later. My father was friends with this guy named Larry Kavanaugh. He fished out of Chatham, and then he moved to New Bedford, Woods Hole, New Bedford. And he built some big draggers. But back then, it was all smaller boats, smaller draggers. And it was this one guy in particular, he had one of the first steel boats built was the Jerry McCarty guy. It was called the Lark. And it was an eastern rig. The house was on the back of the boat. And later in the years, they moved the house forward. Well, right after he moved the house forward, that's when he really started fishing off Chatham. They were catching tremendous amounts of flounder at night. My father goes out, and the buoys are all there, and he pulls, and I was on the boat the previous day. And my father left me home. I believe he left me home for this particular reason, because it was getting bad.
There's all kinds of stories about Jackie Hour coming up onto a dragger and said, taking his gun, coming up alongside, pointing it at the wheelhouse and say, "You stop right now and haul back. And if any of my traps are in your net, you're going to be whittling plugs for holes all the way back to New Bedford."
They were actually talking about, it was him, Ralph Long, Rip Griffin, and Sonny Mallows. They were losing tremendous amounts of gear. And they were talking about shooting somebody. No joke. They were going to shoot somebody, run into Horns Marina. They were going to paint the boat a different color, shoot somebody, go back and paint the boat back to the original color it was supposed to be. And he chased it all the way, and he's waiting for the Coast Guard to come out, and they couldn't get their crap together to get going. And the government was aware of all this, and he chased them halfway. He went around one-on-one. He was shooting away, just shooting away. My father was very colorful. But Kavanaugh, he had a couple of draggers built in the 80s, and I went to work for him one winter, and there was the guy, what they call the engineer on the boat, and he was in charge of keeping the boat going, the hydraulics, maintain the engine while the captain did his thing. These were state-of-the-art boats, and Larry wanted me to go fishing with him, and I did, and this guy comes up, and Larry goes, "John, this is Joe Sam." That was his name. I don't know what his last name was. He had the biggest hands I ever saw on a guy. Tough, just a tough guy. Didn't look tough, but he had he'd been through everything in his, fisherman in the worst weather back then. He had hands twice the size of mine. And Larry goes, "This is Jackie Hour's son." The guy, "Come on." They were drinking beer at this bar, the lee side. "Jesus Christ, your father almost killed me."
And he shot out the glass in the wheelhouse on one boat. In this boat, the Lark, you could, after this war settled down, you could always recognize it because its steadying sail had all kinds of patches in it from, I mean, those are the stories.
Yeah, well, he knew he was in the wrong because he tried to ram my father's boat. He tried to sink him. So he was no better. What was he doing there? He was breaking the law. What my father was doing was trying to protect his business. Jerry tried to, sink him, which was an act of trying to kill him. My father, he said, when I looked up and he saw the boat coming, he just couldn't believe he was going to hit him. And when he hit him, the boat kind of got pushed around, but just black paint and steel against a wood Novi boat, the wood's not going to survive. Because I was fishing with my father, I would just go with him. If I would see the boats, and he'd go out and just him and all the other guys. They were in a raid, tirade because they were just losing pots, which was bad enough, but they were losing their income too. So anyway, the boat gets back to New Bedford, and my father knew a guy up there. He goes, "Jesus, Jackie, what did you do to Jerry's boat?" And it's all shot up. I mean, he blew out the windows, he blew the radar off the roof. He had a big riding sail, a steadying sail. It was ribbons.
Blackjack, the great white savage, they called him, yeah.
The federal marshals were with my father that night. They finally decided they're going to put an end to this because my father had shot at Jerry. The word got out what had happened. The feds are like, somebody's going to die.
And like I said, Jackie Hour actually went out there on foggy nights and brought the state shellfish warden with him, waited for him with a weapon.
Ed Harding was his name. He worked for the state. He was a fed, I think, all for the state. And him, Red Madden, and some other feds went out there. My father's boat. It was a thick fog night. Electronics back then were terrible. And they could see the boats on the radar, and they come flying out of the fog up on one of the eastern rigs that was towing, which was, I don't know the name of the boat. His name was Ainsley Cape. That's the guy's name. Well, anyway, my father comes up beside. They're inside the 3-mile limit, towing through everybody's gear. It's not the guy they wanted. But the fishing was so, they were catching tremendous amounts of flounder, and these guys were breaking the law because they were making a lot of money. And my father came up alongside, and the boats are banging, and he's like, "Somebody jump over there." And they jumped over with shotguns. The feds did, and the guy went straight east to get out of this state line, get back over the 3-mile line. Finally, they got the boat stopped. They seized the boat. They seized the crew. The guy had his son on the boat, and they brought the boat to Stage Harbor, and they tied it up for a long time. It went to trial kind of right away back then compared to now, where it would be a year or two. That boat sat there and never left until it got settled in the courts. After this was over, they all hated my father because the guy they got, this Ainsley Caton, he was like the guy that should not have got arrested. He was the guy that, hey, well, I might as well do it too, but he wasn't one of the big bad guys when this all took off. The reason why they did it was because it was a 3-mile line. You couldn't tow your nets inside of 3 miles from Monomoy all the way back to Provincetown because it was littered with lobster pots.
We went to court for 4 or 5 days, and every time we went in, they got a lobster pot that we had on the bow of the boat that we generally throw over when we were done fishing there. And they would come in carrying the pot, take it out. Come in carrying the pot, take it out. Well, McCarty was smart. He had 8 kids. He took them all to court with him and lined them all up in the front. And the judge asked him, "Why were you there?" He just went like that.
Oh yeah, it's like any business. You try to get away with whatever you can.
It didn't move for months and months while this whole thing went to court and trial. And then my father started getting death threats. until this thing got settled. We had federal marshals that lived in the driveway for a month, especially during the night. Oh yeah, it was, you can't make it up. My mother was visibly shaken up for a long time over this. First of all, she was thought my father was going to go to jail for shooting at the guy, and then the lawyer said, don't worry about it. And then the boat sat in harbor. We had to shut the phone off because my father was getting death threats. The guy that was with, I went fishing with this guy. He's the nicest guy. He goes, your father was crazy, but he had all the right reasons. Like I said, back then, the guys did it themselves, you know? And if the guy did it to a guy for no reason, the other guys would defend that guy. But like what my father was doing with the other guys, trying to protect their livelihood and their business, I don't think anybody had a problem with it. I know that sounds crazy, you know, where now you would have, you know, if Kurt ran into my friend Kurt had a problem protecting his business, he would, you know, go through the legal channels or the legal avenues. Back then, there was no real legal avenues and stuff. The government was small back then. You know, there was, like I said, I believe there was only one guy on the Cape that had the whole Cape, you know, for law enforcement for the Commonwealth of Mass. And he was a rough, tumbly guy. You know, he had to be, you know, because guys back then, like I said, they would take things upon themselves, you know, where nowadays you'd end up in court. And, you know, you'd have the silver bracelets on and, you know, you can't do that stuff anymore.
When it rains, it pours. Water's up to my chin.